Chloe Martinez had always been told that her life would be extraordinary. From the moment she stepped onto the grand stage of academia, her professors whispered that her mind was a rare jewel destined to shine beyond the walls of any single institution. She had grown up in a modest neighborhood in Atlanta, raised by a mother who worked double shifts as a nurse and a father who painted houses by day and sketched dreams by night. Ambition was woven into the rhythm of her childhood, and brilliance was the air she breathed. Yet life has a way of rewriting destinies in the most unexpected ways. At 24, Chloe met Elijah Williams, heir to the sprawling Williams Motors empire, a man whose name alone opened doors to every ballroom in New York, every boardroom in Wall Street, and every society page in America. He was handsome in the way only power could sculpt a man, tall, fair-skinned, with eyes the color of winter skies. He was eloquent, magnetic, and dangerously persuasive. When Elijah looked at Chloe, he didn't just see a woman. He saw a challenge, a conquest, a promise of brilliance he longed to claim as his own. Theirs was a whirlwind romance, painted in shades of champagne and starlight. Lavish dinners at five-star restaurants weekend, getaways to Hampton's mansions, diamond bracelets slipped onto her wrist like mere tokens of affection. The glitter was intoxicating for a girl who had spent her youth in second-hand clothes. And yet beneath it all, Chloe's heart beat not for the luxury, but for the way Elijah made her believe she was indispensable to his future. He told her that her ideas, her research, her dreams were treasures he wanted to protect. He told her she was his equal, his muse, his forever. And so when Elijah asked her to marry him beneath the dazzling lights of Times Square on New Year's Eve, Chloe said yes, with trembling lips and hopeful eyes. She was only 25, and she believed in the poetry of beginnings. But beginnings are deceptive. Marriage to Elijah was not a partnership. It was a performance. The Williams family welcomed Chloe into their glittering dynasty with smiles sharp enough to wound. Margaret Williams, Elijah's mother, greeted her with the air of a queen surveying a servant girl who had stumbled into her court. A scientist, Margaret had murmured during their first luncheon, her diamond necklace catching the light. How unusual. From that day on, Chloe understood she was not to be celebrated for her intellect. She was to be reshaped into the silent, graceful ornament of the Williams family name. At first, she resisted. She spent nights in her study, poring over equations, refining her research on sustainable energy models. But each morning, Elijah would place a glass of wine on her desk and say, "Darling, the family is beginning to ask why you hide away like this. They want to see you at galas, not buried in numbers. Be the wife they expect. I'll take care of the rest." Slowly, reluctantly, and painfully, Chloe laid her dreams to rest. Her research papers, once alive with the fire of discovery, were left unfinished. Her colleagues' emails went unanswered. She traded lab coats for couture gowns, whiteboards for dinner parties, academic conferences for charity galas. The world saw her smiling beside Elijah in glossy magazines, her skin glowing, her figure draped in silk. They called her the jewel of the Williams crown. But behind those photographs lay the truth. Chloe was trapped in a gilded cage. The cage was beautiful, yes, but it was still a cage. The Hamptons mansion where she spent long, lonely summers was a palace of silence. Marble floors echoed her footsteps. Chandeliers glimmered above her head, and ocean waves crashed against the shore, beyond the manicured gardens. But within those walls, Chloe often sat by the window, gazing at the horizon, wondering how a life so golden could feel so suffocating. Elijah adored her presence when it served his image. He introduced her as my brilliant wife at events, though he never allowed her to speak of her brilliance. He held her hand during interviews, smiling for cameras, while whispering criticisms into her ear the moment the lights went out. "You smiled too much tonight," he once hissed as they left a gala. "Do you want people to think you're foolish?" Other times, he accused her of not smiling enough. The standard was ever shifting, a cruel game she could never win. And then came Amelia Carter. Amelia was everything Margaret Williams wanted for her son. Blonde, porcelain-skinned, a socialite polished by boarding schools in Switzerland and finishing schools in Paris. She was the kind of woman who knew which fork to use at a 12-course dinner and how to flatter a room of billionaires without appearing insincere. At first, Elijah introduced Amelia as just a family friend. Chloe noticed the glances, the lingering touches, the way Margaret beamed with approval whenever Amelia's name was spoken. But she swallowed her suspicions, because to accuse her husband would mean admitting to the world that her perfect marriage was a lie. Yet the lie grew harder to ignore. Amelia began spending weekends at the Hamptons estate under the pretense of helping with charity planning. She traveled with Elijah on business trips. She appeared in photographs, her hand brushing his sleeve, her laughter mingling with his. One evening, Chloe entered the dining room to find Amelia seated at the long mahogany table, sipping wine as if she belonged there. Elijah rose to greet his mistress, not his wife. Margaret smiled as though the arrangement was natural. Sophia, Elijah's younger sister, leaned back with a smirk that said, "You are the outsider here, not her." That night, Chloe ate silently, her fork trembling in her hand, her pulse racing in her ears. And it was then, in the heart of that humiliation, that she realized she had been erased from her own life. Years had passed. 10 years, in fact. A decade of sacrifice, silence, and suffocation. 10 years of pretending she was unaware of the betrayal, unaware that her love had been squandered on a man who saw her as disposable. But beneath the silence, something dangerous had been building. Once buried under layers of submission, Chloe's spirit began to stir. The anger, the grief, the indignation, emotions she had been forced to suppress, rose within her like a tidal wave. And though she still played the role of the dutiful wife at dinners, smiled for photographs, and endured Margaret's venomous remarks and Sophia's mockery, inside Chloe was no longer the same woman. She was no longer the jewel of the Williams crown. She was the storm that would shatter it. The world had taken away her voice, but it had not destroyed her will. And in the quiet hours of dawn, when Elijah lay asleep in their sprawling Manhattan penthouse, Chloe sat at her desk again. Not with equations this time, but with plans. Plans of liberation, of justice, of vengeance. The first step would be the hardest. But Chloe had already made her choice. The cage had been gilded long enough. Now it was time to break free. The morning sun broke over Manhattan with cruel clarity, gilding the skyline with a brilliance Chloe could no longer admire. From the expansive windows of the penthouse, she watched the city awake in yellow cabs, darting across avenues, people rushing toward their ambitions, their lives brimming with motion and meaning. And yet, inside the Williams residence, time seemed frozen, suspended in a bubble of wealth that felt more suffocating than secure. For years, Chloe had trained herself to perform the role of the perfect wife. She wore gowns stitched with the threads of Paris, attended luncheons with women who discussed jewelry as if it were scripture, and smiled as cameras captured her alongside Elijah, the golden heir of a dynasty that bore his name. The world saw harmony. They saw beauty. They saw power. But Chloe saw the cracks. It began with the glances, the fleeting, hungry looks Elijah cast at Amelia Carter, when he thought no one was watching. They were subtle at first, ignorable, if she had been the kind of woman willing to live in denial. But Chloe's mind was too precise, too analytical, to dismiss the patterns. She noticed how his laughter softened in Amelia's presence, how his tone sharpened when speaking to her. She saw how Amelia began appearing in places where she didn't belong. Private dinners, charity meetings, intimate gatherings meant only for family. Chloe said nothing. Silence was her shield. She learned long ago that speaking out would only invite ridicule from Margaret and Sophia. She was an outsider to them, symbolizing Elijah's reckless defiance against tradition. Margaret had once told her, her voice dipped in honeyed venom. "You should be grateful, Chloe. Without Elijah, you would be nobody. We gave you this life." It was true in a sense. They had given her the mansion, the penthouse, the glittering gowns, the seats at galas where her presence was required, but her voice unwelcome. But what they had stolen in return was far greater: her dignity, independence, and name. The Williams legacy was a mask, and Chloe had worn it faithfully. But masks, no matter how carefully crafted, eventually fracture. The fracture widened one winter evening at a gala hosted in the marble halls of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The event was a spectacle with chandeliers dripping light onto gowns that shimmered like liquid jewels. Elijah stood at the center, the darling of Wall Street, delivering a speech about innovation and progress. His hand rested lightly on Chloe's back, a gesture for the cameras. But when Amelia walked into the hall, her gown a daring cascade of crimson silk, Elijah's hand slipped away as if burned. His eyes, unguarded for a moment, betrayed him. Chloe felt it. The withdrawal, the shift in air, the unspoken betrayal that lingered in the space between them. And then, as though fate itself wished to humiliate her, Margaret crossed the room to greet Amelia with an embrace far warmer than any she had ever offered Chloe. "Darling, you look radiant," she cooed, her voice carrying across the hall. Elijah has always admired women with such poise. Chloe's chest tightened, but she held her posture. She smiled when cameras flashed, lifted her glass when toasts were made, and laughed at jokes she did not hear. Outwardly, she was flawless. Inwardly, she was crumbling. Later that night, in the back of their limousine, Chloe sat silently beside Elijah. He scrolled through his phone, indifferent to the storm in her heart. At last, she whispered, "You humiliated me tonight." Elijah looked up, his eyes narrowing with irritation rather than guilt. "Don't start, Chloe. You're imagining things. Amelia is just a friend you can't look away from," she replied, her voice low but steady. His jaw tightened. "You're being paranoid. Don't ruin what we have with baseless accusations." What they had. Chloe nearly laughed. They had a mirage, an empire built on appearances, a marriage built on sacrifice, a love that had long since evaporated. But she said nothing more. Because she understood something in that moment. Elijah would never admit his betrayal. And if she pushed, he would turn the blame onto her. So Chloe learned to observe, to collect, to remember. She began noticing details others dismissed. Receipts tucked into Elijah's pockets for Parisian boutiques. She had never visited hotel reservations in Amelia's name. Whispered phone calls were taken in the dead of night. Elijah's voice dropping to a tenderness he had not used to with her in years. Each piece was a fragment forming a mosaic of infidelity. Still, she played her part. She attended dinners. She smiled for photographs. She endured Margaret's disdain and Sophia's smug comments. But inside, Chloe's silence was no longer submission. It was preparation. The cracks in the mask grew deeper one spring afternoon when Chloe arrived at the Hamptons mansion unannounced. She had left Manhattan early, craving the sea air and waves crashing against the shore. But when she opened the door, laughter echoed from the living room. Amelia was sprawled on the white leather sofa, barefoot, sipping wine. Her heels tossed carelessly onto the rug. Elijah sat beside her, his arm draped over the backrest, his smile unguarded and intimate. For a moment, time froze. The betrayal was no longer whispered in shadows. It was painted boldly across the canvas of her life. Amelia rose quickly, feigning surprise. "Chloe, I didn't know you'd be here so soon." Elijah stood as well, his expression unreadable. "This isn't what it looks like," he said, the oldest lie in the oldest book. Chloe's lips curved into a smile, but her eyes burned with quiet fire. "On the contrary," she replied softly, "it's precisely what it looks like." She turned and walked away, her heels clicking against the marble, each step declaring that she would no longer be blind. That night, as the ocean roared outside her window, Chloe sat in the dark, her heart heavy but resolute. The woman who had once surrendered her dreams for love was gone. In her place was a woman who saw the truth clearly, who understood that silence was not enough. She would not confront Elijah, not yet. She would not scream or beg or plead. That was what he expected, what Margaret and Sophia would mock. No, Chloe would bide her time. She would gather her strength, her evidence, her resolve. When the moment came, she would dismantle the illusion of the Williams dynasty piece by piece until the world saw the truth. The cracks in the mask were widening, and Chloe would be the one to break it apart. The night after Chloe walked in on Elijah and Amelia in the Hamptons mansion was not one of tears, but of clarity. For the first time in a decade, her heart did not tremble with doubt or shame. It burned with something sharper, steadier. Anger had always been a dangerous emotion, but in Chloe's chest, it transformed into purpose. She sat at the main bedroom window, the Atlantic Ocean stretching dark and endless. The waves crashed like drums of war, each one echoing her heartbeat. She had given Elijah her silence, patience, and loyalty for years. Now she realized silence was her greatest mistake. Silence was what allowed them to erase her. Her reflection in the glass startled her. She barely recognized the woman staring back. The once bright scholar who dreamed of reshaping the future of sustainable energy had been replaced by a socialite trained to smile on command. Her skin was flawless, her hair styled to perfection, but her eyes were hollow, robbed of the fire that once made her extraordinary. Yet beneath that emptiness, a spark flickered, and Chloe knew it was not too late to reclaim herself. The next morning, Chloe returned to Manhattan. She dismissed the driver at the curb of the penthouse and walked the final blocks alone, the click of her heels sharp against the pavement. For the first time in years, she felt the city's pulse, not as a prison, but as a reminder of resilience. Yes, New York was brutal, but it rewarded those who fought for their place, and Chloe was ready to fight. Her first step was to call Daniel Brown. Daniel had been her friend since her early years at Columbia University. Where Elijah had dazzled with wealth, Daniel had always offered her something more precious: respect. He had followed her career with quiet admiration, celebrated her research, and later watched with disappointment as she disappeared into the role of Mrs. Williams. Now a successful attorney, Daniel answered her call with surprise. "Chloe." His voice carried both warmth and worry. "It's been years." "I know," she said softly, "but I need your help." There was a pause. Then Daniel replied, "Tell me where to meet you." They met in a small cafe on the Lower East Side, far from the polished streets of Midtown, where society women lunched. Chloe arrived in a plain coat, her hair pulled back, her eyes shielded by dark glasses. She felt anonymous and oddly free for the first time in years. When Daniel saw her, his expression tightened. "You look different." "Different is good," she answered. Over steaming cups of coffee, she told him everything. Not the humiliations, not the insults. Those were wounds she chose to keep private, but the truth of Elijah's betrayal, the misuse of her dowry, the stolen years. Daniel listened without interruption, his jaw hardening with every word. "Chloe," he said finally, "you have more power than you think. If Elijah has used your assets, if his empire is built partly on your intellectual property, the law is on your side. But it won't be easy. The Williams family has influence. They will fight you with everything they have." Chloe lifted her chin. "Then let them. They've underestimated me for too long." That night, Chloe unlocked a drawer in her study that had remained untouched for nearly a decade. Inside were stacks of notebooks, sketches of engines, and detailed models of energy systems that she had abandoned when Elijah persuaded her to step away from academia. Dust coated the pages, but her pulse quickened as she flipped through them. Her ideas, her brilliance were still here waiting for her. She spread the notebooks across her desk, the lamplight casting long shadows. For hours, she worked piecing together the remnants of her research. Though her hands trembled at first, muscle memory soon returned. Equations flowed from her pen with the ease of breathing. By dawn, the hollow gaze in her reflection had been replaced with determination. For the first time in years, Chloe felt alive. It wasn't about revenge. Not entirely. It was about reclaiming what was hers, about proving to herself that she was more than Elijah's ornament, more than Margaret's scapegoat, more than society's silent jewel. She was Chloe Martinez, a woman whose mind had once promised to change the world. And that woman still existed. In the weeks that followed, Chloe perfected the art of pretense. Outwardly, nothing had changed. She continued to attend galas, smile at Elijah's side, and endure Amelia's presence in their circle. But inwardly, she was sharper, more calculating. She began noticing the shifts in Elijah's behavior with a strategist's eye. His late nights, his evasive excuses, the way Amelia's perfume lingered on his suits. She documented everything quietly, meticulously. Each detail was a weapon she stored away for the battle she knew was coming. Margaret sensed something had shifted. She studied Chloe in the mirror as they prepared for a luncheon one afternoon. "You've grown quieter," Margaret remarked, her tone edged with suspicion. Chloe met her gaze without flinching. "I've learned that silence speaks louder than words." Margaret's lips curved into a thin smile, but her eyes narrowed. For the first time, Chloe felt unease from the woman who had always exuded control. It was a small victory, but it fueled her resolve. Chloe knew her decision would not be without cost. At night, she lay awake staring at the ceiling, haunted by the enormity of what she was preparing to do. Divorce in the world of the elite was not simply personal. It was a public spectacle, a weapon wielded in newspapers and whispered in boardrooms. To leave Elijah would mean declaring war on the Williams dynasty, and Chloe would be painted as the villain. But what terrified her more was the thought of remaining. 10 years had already been stolen. 10 years of her voice silenced, her dreams deferred. If she stayed, she would lose not just herself, but the legacy she was meant to build. No, the greater risk was to do nothing. One evening, unable to endure the suffocating walls of the penthouse, Chloe walked alone through Central Park. The air was crisp, scented with rain. She paused by the lake, watching the ripples shimmer beneath the city lights. Around her, couples strolled hand in hand, laughter rising from children chasing kites. She felt a pang not of jealousy, but of longing. Longing for simplicity, authenticity, and a life where love was not a performance, but a truth. A little girl ran past her, clutching a red balloon. For a fleeting moment, Chloe imagined herself younger, unburdened, filled with the reckless certainty that the future was hers to shape. And then she realized, perhaps it still was. When Chloe returned home that night, Elijah was waiting, his expression taut with irritation. "Where have you been?" he demanded. She removed her coat calmly. "Walking. At this hour, alone. Do you know what people will say?" Chloe met his anger with a steady gaze. For the first time, she felt no fear. Let them talk. Something in her tone unsettled him. He opened his mouth to argue, then closed it, his jaw tight. He turned away, dismissing her with a wave of his hand. But Chloe smiled faintly as she climbed the stairs. Because at that moment, she knew the decision had already been made. She would break free. In the following weeks, Chloe worked quietly with Daniel, gathering documents, tracing the flow of her dowry into the arteries of the Williams empire. Each discovery fueled her determination. The company that bore Elijah's name had been nourished by her sacrifice, brilliance, and inheritance, and soon the world would know it. But beyond the legal battle's strategies and evidence, something deeper carried her forward, the rediscovery of herself. She was no longer the woman who sat silently while her husband paraded his mistress before her. She was no longer the ornament polished for society's gaze. She was no longer the jewel locked in a cage. Chloe Martinez was becoming again the woman she was always meant to be: fierce, brilliant, unstoppable. And though Elijah, Margaret, and Amelia still moved as though the stage belonged to them, Chloe knew the truth. The performance was ending. The cracks had widened, the mask was shattering, and the world would soon see what lay beneath. For now, she remained silent, patient, deliberate. But within her, a storm gathered, one that would sweep away the illusions of the Williams dynasty and leave nothing but truth in its wake. And as the dawn broke over Manhattan once more, Chloe stood by the penthouse window, her reflection no longer hollow. In her eyes burned the fire of a woman who had decided she would never be caged again. The Williams mansion in the Hamptons had always been a theater of illusions, rooms bathed in golden light, laughter that echoed like music, the air perfumed with wealth. Yet to Chloe, every chandelier shimmered with falsehood, every polished surface reflected a lie. She had endured a decade of humiliation behind those walls, but now she walked their corridors differently. Her steps were no longer hesitant. They were deliberate, steady, charged with the quiet thunder of someone who had nothing to lose. It was a Saturday afternoon when Margaret summoned the family for a luncheon. Margaret believed luncheons were where reputations were maintained. Unity was staged, and Chloe would be reminded of her place. The long oak table was dressed in ivory linen, crystal glasses sparkling under the sunlit windows. Margaret presided at the head, Elijah on her right, Sophia smirking at her left. Amelia sat near Elijah, as if she were born to that chair. Chloe entered last. She wore a simple black dress, unadorned by jewelry. Against the excess of the room, her simplicity was disarming. It unsettled them. Margaret's eyes narrowed. Sophia's smirk faltered. Elijah looked up sharply, and Amelia's painted lips curved into a smile too broad to be innocent. "Chloe, darling," Margaret began, her voice dripping with condescension. "How good of you to join us. We thought you'd forgotten your duties as hostess." Chloe sat gracefully, her back straight. "On the contrary, Margaret, I decided to arrive when the performance was ready to begin." A silence followed, brief but sharp. Sophia snorted, but her eyes darted to Elijah for a reaction. The meal began. Polished silver cut through roasted lamb, glasses clinked, and conversations fluttered like rehearsed lines. Margaret spoke of charity events, Sophia gossiped about Manhattan's scandals, and Amelia contributed anecdotes with feigned modesty. Through it all, Elijah played the doting son and lover, dividing his attention between his mother's pride and Amelia's charm. But Chloe remained silent, listening, observing. Every gesture, every word, every stolen glance between Elijah and Amelia was fuel for the storm she had been gathering. Halfway through the meal, Amelia leaned toward Elijah, whispering something that drew a chuckle from his lips. Its intimacy was obscene in its brazenness. Chloe set down her fork, the clink loud in the sudden quiet. "Elijah," she said softly, her voice carrying across the table. Do share the joke with the rest of us. Elijah stiffened, caught off guard. It was nothing, Chloe. A private remark. Chloe's gaze sharpened. Strange. How much of our marriage has become private? The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. Margaret's fork paused mid-air. Sophia's eyes gleamed with anticipation, and Amelia's smile faltered. Chloe. Elijah warned, his voice low, but Chloe only smiled, serene and unshaken. Don't worry, darling. I've learned that truth has a way of surfacing no matter how deeply it's buried. The luncheon continued, but the ease was gone. Every glance was sharper, every silence heavier. Later that evening, Margaret confronted Chloe in the drawing room. The matriarch stood near the fireplace, her posture regale, her pearls gleaming like armor. What was that performance at lunch? Margaret demanded. You embarrassed Elijah. You embarrassed this family. Chloe met her gaze without flinching. I only asked for honesty. Surely honesty is not an embarrassment. Margaret's eyes blazed. Please don't play games with me. You knew what you were marrying into. This family does not tolerate disobedience. Chloe tilted her head slightly, her voice calm. Disobedience or independence? Margaret stepped closer, her tone icy. You were nothing before Elijah. We gave you a name, a life, a crown. Do not forget where you came from. Chloe's composure cracked into a smile for the first time, not of amusement, but of revelation. You're right, Margaret. I will never forget where I came from, because unlike you, I know what it means to build something from nothing. You mistake silence for weakness. That will be your undoing. Margaret faltered just for a moment. And in that hesitation, Chloe knew her first strike had landed. The following week, Elijah hosted a dinner for investors at the penthouse in Manhattan. Chloe dressed in midnight blue, her elegance understated, yet commanding. She played the dutiful wife, flawlessly greeting guests and offering polite conversation. Elijah, relieved by her composure, grew careless. Toward the end of the evening, as champagne flowed and laughter filled the room, Chloe excused herself. She returned moments later with a slim folder in her hand. Approaching the table, she placed it before Elijah with quiet finality. You should explain this to your guests. Elijah's face drained of color. The folder contained copies of financial transfers, funds from Chloe's dowry, funneled into accounts that financed Amelia's ventures abroad. Gasps rippled around the table. Elijah stammered, reaching for the folder, but Chloe's hand pressed it firmly against the table. Careful, she murmured, her voice smooth as silk. Paper cuts can be terribly painful. The guests exchanged uneasy glances, their polite laughter dissolving into silence. Elijah forced a chuckle, attempting to dismiss it as a misunderstanding. But Chloe's eyes held his unyielding, and everyone at that table knew the mask had slipped. The next day, Amelia appeared at Chloe's door. Her composure was frayed, her beauty diminished by desperation. Why are you doing this? Amelia demanded. You've had him for years. Why can't you just let him go? Chloe regarded her coolly. Let him go, Amelia. You mistake me. I'm not holding Elijah. He is keeping me, or at least he thinks he is. Amelia's voice shook. He loves me. Chloe's laugh was soft, almost pitying. Then you should pray that he treats you better than he treated me. But love, Amelia. Love built on betrayal is not love. It's only hunger. Amelia's eyes welled with tears, but Chloe felt no satisfaction, only certainty. The girl was not her enemy. She was a symptom. The disease was Elijah, and the dynasty that enabled him. That evening, Elijah finally confronted Chloe in private. He stormed into her study, slamming the door behind him. What game are you playing? he demanded, his voice trembling with fury. Chloe closed her notebook calmly. No game. Elijah. Only truth. You're trying to destroy me. She rose, meeting him eye to eye. No, Elijah. You destroyed yourself. I'm only lifting the curtain. His hand twitched as though he wanted to grab her, but he froze under her unflinching gaze. For the first time in their marriage, Elijah seemed uncertain, not of her, but of himself. You think you can walk away from this family? He spat. You'll have nothing. Chloe's smile was cold and radiant all at once. On the contrary, Elijah, I'll have everything you tried to take from me. And you'll have nothing but the ashes of your own lies. In the days that followed, whispers spread. Investors grew wary. Society's smiles sharpened into speculation. Margaret tried to tighten her grip, hosting grander luncheons, projecting strength. But beneath the glitter, unease pulsed. Chloe moved with serene precision. She attended every event, her poise unshaken, her presence luminous. People began to look at her differently, not as Elijah's silent ornament, but as a woman of steel, hidden beneath silk. And though Elijah still strutted in public, though Amelia still lingered at his side, Chloe knew the truth. The balance of power had shifted. She had unmasked the betrayal. Not entirely yet, but enough to let the world glimpse the cracks. And soon, those cracks would shatter the mask completely. The Williams name had always been synonymous with power. It had shimmered across Manhattan for decades like a crown of untouchable wealth. Their parties were spectacles, their marriages alliances, their scandals carefully erased before they could ever reach the press. But empires do not fall overnight. They crumble first with whispers. And now whispers followed Elijah Williams everywhere. It began subtly at a dinner hosted by the Harringtons on Park Avenue. Chloe, draped in a gown, the color of midnight velvet, stood beside Elijah as they greeted guests. She had perfected her mask again, a serene expression, her smile curved like a blade. The room glittered with laughter and crystal, but murmurs stirred like an underground river underneath the noise. She caught him with the model, one woman whispered to another. Not caught, came the reply, hushed, but eager, exposed. At his own dinner table. Surely not. The Williams family would never allow such a spectacle. Oh, but they couldn't stop it. She laid the proof before him in front of investors. The laughter around the room rang too loudly. The champagne fizzed too sharply. Unaware of the exact words, but keenly attuned to tones, Elijah sensed the shift. He glanced at Chloe, who only sipped her wine, her eyes calm and distant, as though she had already abandoned the performance. Within days, the whispers reached the society columns. At first, they appeared as delicate suggestions cloaked in euphemism. Sources close to the Williams family suggest tensions behind the gilded doors of their Manhattan penthouse. Though Elijah Williams and his wife Chloe continue to make appearances together, speculation abounds regarding the presence of a particular model frequently spotted at his side. Elijah was furious. He stormed through the penthouse, slamming newspapers onto polished tables, demanding explanations from his publicist's mother and anyone who would listen. Margaret assured him it was a passing storm, easily silenced. Sophia laughed it off, amused that her brother had finally been caught. But Chloe said nothing. She read the papers each morning, folded them neatly, and set them aside. Her silence was louder than any denial Elijah might attempt. The eruption occurred at the Spring Benefactors Gala at the Waldorf Astoria. It was the event of the season, attended by senators, CEOs, and celebrities draped in couture. The Williams family arrived in full force, determined to project unity. Margaret wore pearls heavy as armor. Sophia sparkled in emeralds, and Elijah's jaw was set in stone. Chloe, however, floated into the room in ivory silk, her presence luminous and unbothered. For the first hour, the performance held. Photographers captured images of the family smiling together, Glasses of champagne raised high. But beneath the surface, tension sizzled. Elijah clung to Chloe's arm, as if forcing proximity could undo distance. Amelia lingered at the edge of the room, her eyes flicking toward Elijah with a desperation she could no longer conceal. It happened during the auction. The host was mid-sentence when Amelia stepped forward, emboldened by jealousy and wine. Her voice, high and trembling, pierced the air. "Why pretend?" she cried, her eyes locked on Chloe. "Everyone knows he loves me." Gasps erupted. Conversations froze. All eyes swung to the stage where Elijah, pale and sweating, tried to hush her. But Amelia shook him off, her tears glittering under the chandeliers. For years, she sobbed, "He's told me I was the one. He promised me everything. And you—" Her gaze cut to Chloe, sharp as glass. "You've kept him chained. You think money or name makes you his wife? He belongs to me." The silence that followed was deafening. Then came the rush of voices, the hiss of scandal spreading like fire through dry leaves. Cameras flashed, capturing Amelia's breakdown, Elijah's stunned face, and Chloe's serene composure. Chloe did not flinch. She rose from her chair, her movements unhurried, graceful. The room parted as she walked to Amelia, her heels clicking softly against marble. She stopped just before her, her voice low but clear enough for the microphones nearby. "My dear Chloe," said gently, "if a man belongs to you, you need not announce it. The fact that you must scream it tells the world otherwise." Amelia crumpled into sobs. Elijah grabbed her arm, and Margaret rushed to salvage what dignity she could. But it was too late. The scandal had erupted publicly in front of the city's most potent, and serene and untouchable Chloe had orchestrated it without raising her voice. The following morning, the headlines blazed. "Williams Dynasty. Shaken Mistress Claims Elijah's Heart at Gala." Chloe Martinez Williams, the silent storm behind society's most elegant scandal. Photographs captured Amelia's tears, Elijah's fury, Margaret's panic, and Chloe's calm poise. Commentators praised her dignity, speculating that she had long endured in silence. Editorials spoke of her strength, her composure, her quiet power. Elijah raged. "Do you see what you've done?" he shouted, slamming newspapers onto the breakfast table. "You've destroyed me." Chloe looked up from her coffee, her eyes cool. "No, Elijah, you destroyed yourself. I stepped aside so the world could see." Margaret seethed, blaming Chloe for Amelia's outburst, the headlines, and the crumbling facade. But Sophia, for once, said nothing. She watched Chloe with awe, recognizing a strength she had never acknowledged. Manhattan's elite are quick to shift allegiance. Where once Chloe had been dismissed as the outsider, whispers now called her the Phoenix. Invitations poured in. Journalists clamored for interviews, and designers offered gowns. She declined them all, her silence a further act of control. Elijah, meanwhile, was shunned. Investors withdrew, wary of instability. His once flawless image as heir of the dynasty was now tainted, and he found doors closing that had always opened to him. At luncheons, women whispered not of his charm, but of his humiliation. At board meetings, men questioned his judgment. The empire that had seemed unassailable now trembled on its foundations. Chloe did not gloat. She did not need to. Her victory was not in headlines or whispers, but in the quiet reclamation of her identity. She returned to her notebook's research and forgotten self each day. Each page reminded her that she was more than a scandal, more than a wife, more than a pawn in the Williams name. Yet even as she rebuilt herself, she knew the battle was not over. The Williams family would not surrender easily. Margaret's pride, Elijah's desperation, Amelia's obsession, these forces would resist until the very end. But Chloe was no longer afraid. One evening, Elijah confronted her again. He found her in the study, her notebook spread before her. "Why are you doing this?" he demanded, his voice raw. "If you leave, you'll ruin me. Is that what you want?" Chloe looked up, her eyes calm, her voice steady. "What I want is freedom. What I want is the truth. If your ruin is the price of that, so be it." He sank into the chair opposite her, his face pale. For the first time, Elijah looked small. "You used to love me," he whispered. "I did," Chloe replied softly, "and I gave you everything. But love cannot survive betrayal. It dies quietly, Elijah, like a candle in the wind. And when it dies, all that remains is the truth." He said nothing more. By summer, the Williams name had lost its sheen. Investors pulled back, and rumors of financial instability swirled. Amelia vanished from public view, whisked away to Europe. Margaret retreated to the Hamptons, furious but powerless. And Chloe walked through the city, not as a shadow, but as herself. She met with Daniel in discreet offices, her plans for legal separation unfolding with precision. She dined with old colleagues, her mind alive with ideas once abandoned. She stood in front of mirrors and saw not a trophy wife, but Chloe Martinez, the woman who had survived, had risen, and had unmasked the betrayal. The scandal had erupted, yes, but it was not her downfall. It was her beginning. And though Elijah still clung to fragments of dignity and tried to piece together the shattered mask, Chloe knew the truth: once broken masks can never be mended. The world had seen too much, and soon it would see everything. The scandal at the Waldorf had left the Williams name in ruins, but ruins have a strange quality. Some wander them in despair, while others see foundations waiting to be rebuilt. Elijah, Margaret, and Sophia scrambled among the ashes, frantic to salvage what could not be saved. But Chloe walked through the wreckage with quiet poise, as though the fall of their dynasty was nothing more than a season long overdue. For years, she had lived in their shadow. Now the shadow had crumbled, and the light touched her face for the first time in a decade. The morning after the headlines erupted, Chloe sat in her study with Daniel Brown across the desk. The lawyer's eyes glimmered with restrained triumph as he spread documents, bank transfers, company ledgers, contracts. "It's worse than we thought," Daniel said, tapping the pages. "They didn't just misuse your dowry. They siphoned, repurposed, and built cornerstones of Williams Motors on it. Without your money, their empire would have collapsed before Elijah became its darling." Chloe's fingers traced the ink lines, her nails pale against the paper. 10 years of silence crystallized into proof undeniable and devastating. "They've stolen everything," she whispered. "No," Daniel corrected gently. "They borrowed everything. And now it's time for you to collect the debt." Chloe leaned back in her chair, her gaze steady. "Then let's begin." The first blow came quietly. Chloe liquidated the penthouse property on Central Park West, the jewel Margaret often boasted of as proof of Elijah's success. But Chloe's name was etched on the deed, her dowry the seed of its purchase. The sale was swift, and the proceeds were transferred into accounts under her sole control. When Margaret discovered it, her fury shook the Hamptons mansion. "You dare!" she screamed across the phone, her voice ragged with disbelief. "That property is part of this family's legacy." Chloe's tone was calm, almost tender. "Correction. Margaret, that property was mine. I merely reclaimed what belonged to me. You, ungrateful. Ungrateful." Chloe's voice hardened, slicing through the venom. "For what should I be grateful? 10 years of humiliation, of silence, of watching you smile at the woman my husband paraded before me. No, Margaret. Gratitude is for gifts. You gave me nothing but chains, and I've decided to return them. The line went dead, but Chloe smiled faintly at the silence. Elijah fared no better. The scandal had stripped him of his image. Chloe now stripped him of his security. With Daniel's guidance, she froze accounts tied to her inheritance and demanded audits of corporate structures that relied on her intellectual property. Contracts Elijah had signed in arrogance now returned like knives to his throat. One evening, he confronted her in the Manhattan townhouse, one of the few properties still in his name. His once impeccable suit was creased, his eyes bloodshot, his composure fractured. "You think you've won?" he snarled. "Do you know how this makes you look? Bitter, vindictive society will turn against you." Chloe's gaze was steady, her voice soft. Society already chose Elijah. They saw the mistress scream your secrets under chandeliers. They saw me remain silent. Tell me, who do you think they pity, and who do they despise? Elijah's mouth opened, then closed. For the first time, his words failed him. "Everything you built was mine first," Chloe continued, "and soon it will be mine again. You mistook my silence for weakness. But weakness, Elijah, is believing masks can last forever." Sophia, once the cruel chorus of Margaret's disdain, fell strangely quiet. At a dinner hosted by one of Manhattan's remaining loyal families, Chloe caught Sophia staring at her across the room, not with malice, but with reluctant recognition. When the evening ended, Sophia approached, her voice low. "You terrify them," she admitted. Chloe arched a brow. "And you?" Sophia hesitated, then smiled bitterly. "Perhaps I admire you. You survived what none of us thought you could. You've turned their kingdom to dust without lifting your voice." Chloe's reply was soft, deliberate. "That is the difference between power and noise, Sophia. One vanishes in the air. The other lingers long after the room is empty." Sophia said nothing more, but when she left, Chloe sensed the faintest tremor of respect. Amid the battles, Chloe found herself again in the quiet hours. Nights were no longer spent in restless silence beside Elijah's cold form. Instead, she filled them with equations, sketches, and ideas reborn. Her notebooks grew thick with new visions for energy engines and innovations the world had forgotten she once promised. She met with former colleagues, men and women, who had mourned her disappearance from academia. Some were surprised, others elated, all eager to collaborate. With Daniel's help, Chloe began registering patents in her name, securing what Elijah had once tried to claim as his. For the first time in years, she wasn't just surviving, she was creating, and creation, Chloe realized, was the purest form of power. Amelia, once bold and brazen, had vanished from the city. Rumors swirled of her exile to Europe. Her modeling contracts dissolved her name, whispered in derision. The woman who had flaunted herself at Elijah's side was now a ghost, a cautionary tale of misplaced ambition. Chloe thought of her sometimes not with hatred, but with a strange, distant pity. Amelia believed in herself as victorious, only to discover she was never more than a pawn in Margaret's game. Elijah's hunger and society's spectacle. Chloe's war was never truly with Amelia. The girl had only been a mirror, reflecting Elijah's betrayal. And Chloe, at last, no longer needed mirrors. The shift came at a dinner hosted by the Vanderlyns, one of New York's oldest families. The Williams had been invited, but Elijah arrived alone. Chloe entered later, luminous in sapphire silk, her presence eclipsing the whispers that filled the hall. When Elijah attempted to approach her, the hosts intercepted him, guiding him toward lesser seats. Chloe was ushered to the table of honor. Society had chosen its queen. During the meal, conversation turned inevitably toward scandal. A senator's wife leaned toward Chloe, her voice low but audible. "My dear, you must tell us how you endure such humiliation gracefully." Chloe's smile was poised, her eyes calm. "Grace," she replied, is not the absence of humiliation. It is the refusal to be defined by it. The table fell silent, then erupted in murmurs of admiration. Elijah, seated at the edge, clenched his glass until it nearly shattered. Margaret could no longer bear the shift. She summoned Chloe one final time to the Hamptons, hoping to reclaim control. The confrontation occurred in the drawing room where portraits of ancestors loomed like silent judges. "You've destroyed us," Margaret hissed. "Do you understand? The Williams name is in tatters because of you." Chloe regarded her with calm composure. "No, Margaret. The Williams name is in tatters because of Elijah's choices and your approval of them." Margaret's hands trembled. "You'll never be one of us." Chloe's laugh was soft, unyielding. "I never wanted to be. I was never yours to own. I was only myself, and that Margaret is more than you will ever be." The matriarch's face blanched, her fury silenced by a truth too sharp to answer. As summer waned, Chloe stood again at the windows of Manhattan, gazing at the city she had once viewed as a prison. Now, it was a battlefield. She had conquered a stage she commanded. The ashes of the Williams dynasty smoldered behind her, but before her lay something brighter, fiercer freedom. Her finances secured her research, reignited her dignity, restored Chloe, no longer carried the weight of survival. She had the fire of renewal. The newspapers spoke of her as a mystery, a storm, a phoenix. But Chloe knew the truth. She was not reborn from fire. She had carried the fire within her all along. It had only taken betrayal to remind her to let it burn. And though Elijah and Margaret still scrambled to salvage what they could, Chloe no longer looked back. Their world was ashes. Hers was power. Autumn settled over Manhattan with a solemn beauty. The trees along Fifth Avenue blazed with crimson and gold, their colors deepened by the fading light of October evenings. The restless and relentless city seemed to soften under the season's melancholy veil. It was a strange reflection of her life for Chloe, a season of endings, and the whisper of beginnings she could not yet name. The Williams family had fallen silent. Margaret no longer called Sophia, drifted away into her amusements, and Elijah sulked in obscurity. Their empire was fractured, their reputation marred, and Chloe had reclaimed her independence with quiet dignity. Yet despite her triumphs, a hollowness lingered, a space where love had once lived, now emptied by betrayal. She told herself she did not need it. Love had proven a dangerous illusion, a gilded promise that disguised chains. And yet, there were moments, brief, unexpected, when her heart betrayed her. Walking alone through Central Park at dusk, she would hear the laughter of couples and feel the echo of what she had lost. She did not long for Elijah. No, that chapter was burned beyond recognition, but for the intimacy of being seen, truly seen, without disguise or performance. It was during such a moment of quiet reflection that Alexander Hughes returned to her life. The evening was unremarkable at first. Chloe attended a private exhibition at the Whitney Museum, a gathering of artists, patrons, and collectors. She wore a gown of deep emerald, her hair swept into a knot that revealed the graceful curve of her neck. The air hummed with conversation, glasses of wine glimmering like rubies in the soft light. Chloe moved through the gallery with poise, pausing before a painting of violent brush strokes, an ocean storm captured in shades of black and indigo. It stirred something in her, the chaos of the past year, the fury she had tamed, the tempest she had survived. Fascinating. A voice said beside her, low measured, carrying a resonance that seemed to linger even after the words faded. She turned. Alexander Hughes stood there, taller than she remembered his presence, commanding without effort. His hair was touched with silver at the temples, his tailored suit understated, yet impossibly refined. But his eyes, gray steady, piercing, held her. He continued gesturing toward the painting, saying that storms are violent, unpredictable, and terrifying. Yet without them, the sea would never reveal its power. Calm waters teach us nothing. Chloe felt her breath catch, not at his words alone, but at the recognition that he had been watching the same storm she carried inside. "Mr. Hughes," she said softly, recovering her composure. "It has been a long time." "Alexander," he corrected gently. "Please. We've known each other too long for formality." They had met years ago, when Chloe was still a rising academic star. At a university conference, Alexander, already a titan in technology, had attended one of her lectures on sustainable energy. He had spoken to her afterwards, asking thoughtful questions, his interest not in her beauty, but in her mind. She had been struck by the respect in his gaze, a rarity, in a world where men often measured her worth by her appearance. Soon after, Elijah entered her life, dazzling her with charm and overwhelming her with attention. Alexander had faded into the background, retreating with quiet dignity. Standing beside him in the gallery, Chloe felt the weight of that unspoken history. He had been there once at the threshold of her destiny. And fate, it seemed, had circled back. They moved together through the gallery, speaking in low tones. Alexander asked of her work, her research, her return to herself. Unlike Elijah, he did not diminish her ambitions. He celebrated them as though her brilliance was a gift to the world. "I followed your early work," he admitted, "even when the world thought you had abandoned it. I never believed you had." Chloe glanced at him, surprised. "And why is that?" "Because minds like yours don't go silent," he said. "They may be silenced, but they never cease. I knew one day you would return." The words sank deep, not as flattery, but as truth. For so long, Chloe had been told her intellect was a liability, a threat, a distraction from her role as wife. To hear it honored again felt like water on parched ground. At the end of the evening, Alexander turned to her as the crowd thinned and coats were gathered. "There's a new project I'm investing in," he said. "Clean energy, sustainable infrastructure. I value your perspective. Consider dinner sometime." Chloe hesitated. Dinner. The word carried weight, but his gaze was steady, unpressured. It was not the demand of a man accustomed to conquest, but the invitation of one who understood choice. "I'll consider it," she said at last, her voice measured. His smile was faint, almost imperceptible, but his eyes softened. "That's all I ask." In the following weeks, Chloe thought of him more than she wished to admit. His voice lingered, his words echoing in her mind during late nights at her desk. She attended meetings with Daniel, drafted legal strategies, and pursued her patents. But in quiet moments, the memory of Alexander's steady gaze returned, like a compass pointing towards something unnamed. One evening, she accepted his invitation. They dined at a quiet restaurant in Tribeca, a place of exposed brick and candlelight. The city roared outside, but inside, the world felt suspended, intimate. Alexander spoke not of society gossip or corporate victories, but of philosophy, history, and art. He listened to her as though every word mattered, and asked questions that revealed he had studied her work deeply. "You remind me of this city," he said at one point, his eyes on her. "Relentless, scarred, beautiful, not despite the storms, but because of them." Chloe felt something stir within her, a warmth she had long buried, a reminder that love, when true, did not suffocate, but set free. News travels quickly in Manhattan. When Elijah heard whispers of Chloe dining with Hughes, his fury ignited. He confronted her days later, his voice dripping with bitterness. "So this is your plan," he sneered. "You destroy me, then throw yourself at Hughes. Do you think the world will respect you for it?" Chloe's reply was quiet, her eyes unflinching. "Respect is not granted by the world, Elijah. It is earned by truth, something you never understood." His face reddened. his words stumbling. For the first time, Elijah realized she was beyond his reach, legally, financially, and emotionally. Whatever remained between them had turned to ash. Alexander did not rush her. He appeared in her life gently, steadily, like the tide returning to shore. He attended her lectures when she began presenting her renewed research. He introduced her to networks of innovators, scientists, and philanthropists. Where Elijah had clipped her wings, Alexander cleared the sky. Yet it was not merely professional. There were moments, small, tender, that revealed something more profound. The brush of his hand as he guided her through a crowded room. The way his gaze lingered when she laughed. The unspoken promise that he saw her not as an ornament or a conquest, but as an equal. Chloe resisted at first. Fear lingered like a shadow. Fear of being deceived again, of surrendering to another illusion. But with each passing day, Alexander proved himself not with grand gestures, but with consistency, patience, and the quiet certainty of a man who had waited a decade to stand beside her. One evening, as they walked along the Hudson, Chloe asked the question that had long lingered. Why now, Alexander? Why step forward after all these years? He paused, the river glimmering behind him. Because before you were not free. You were trapped in a cage you could not yet see. To interfere then would have been cruelty. So I waited. I watched. And when you broke the cage yourself, I knew the woman I admired was still there. The world tried to silence you, Chloe. But I always knew your fire would return. I only hoped when it did, I could be near enough to witness it. Chloe's breath caught. In that moment, the walls around her heart cracked, not shattered, but softened. She did not answer with words. Instead, she let the silence speak, a silence heavy with possibility. From that evening onward, Chloe felt the course of her life shift. The ashes of betrayal no longer defined her. The fire of renewal no longer burned alone. Alexander was not a rescuer. She did not need one, but a presence that amplified her strength, reflected her worth, and reminded her that even storms give way to horizons. The Williams dynasty lay in ruins behind her. Ahead stretched a path uncharted, uncertain, but illuminated by freedom, and perhaps, just perhaps, by love reborn. Chloe did not feel like a woman surviving for the first time in years. She felt like a woman beginning. Winter swept into Manhattan with sharp winds and silver skies. The city glittered beneath strings of holiday lights, yet the season no longer carried the same weight it once had for Chloe. In years past, she had stood at Elijah's side during charity balls and family gatherings, smiling as photographers captured their perfect facade. Those nights had been cages dressed in tinsel. Now freedom wrapped around her like fur against the cold. And beside her, quietly steadfast, was Alexander Hughes. His presence did not overwhelm. It grounded. He entered her life with the calm certainty of a man with nothing to prove, whose power did not need parades or applause. When he reached for her hand, it was not to claim possession, but to offer steadiness. When he looked at her, it was not with hunger, but with recognition, as though he had been waiting to meet her all over again. Not the wife of Elijah, but Chloe Martinez, in her most valid form. Manhattan society thrives on stories, and Chloe had become its most whispered name. At luncheons and soirees, women leaned close to one another, their jeweled hands cupping crystal glasses. They say she dines with Hughes. More than dines. She's at his side at board meetings and conferences. Imagine it, the Williams' discarded wife, stepping into Hughes's empire. What began as a rumor soon became inevitable. Chloe and Alexander appeared together at the Rockefeller Foundation gala. He stood at her side, his palm resting lightly against her back, his expression one of quiet pride as she addressed philanthropists about renewable energy initiatives. Cameras flashed, but Chloe was not reduced to an ornament this time. She was not Elijah's accessory, nor Margaret's scapegoat. She was Chloe, brilliant, eloquent, commanding, and Alexander allowed the world to see it. Together their image rippled across society pages, the Phoenix and the Titan. Commentators speculated endlessly. Was this romance alliance, or both? In truth, it was something more profound. Their relationship unfolded not with fiery declarations, but with subtle certainties. Nights in his penthouse, overlooking the Hudson, where they spoke of dreams rather than gossip. Chloe lost herself in books afternoons in his library, while Alexander worked quietly beside her. They moved in rhythm, unhurried, unforced, as though their souls had always known this dance. One evening, as snow drifted against the tall windows, the shift became undeniable. When Alexander entered the room with 2 glasses of red wine, Chloe sketched models for a new energy grid. He set one beside her and studied her notes with genuine interest. This design, he said softly, isn't just brilliant. It's revolutionary. Chloe smiled faintly. Revolutionary ideas are dangerous. They frighten people who cling to old power. Then it's a good thing, Alexander murmured, his eyes lifting to hers, that you no longer walk alone. The silence that followed was rich-weighted. No ring kneeling or rehearsed words, but the truth was undeniable. His vow was not an ornament of diamonds. It was the constancy of his presence, the certainty of his faith in her. And Chloe, for the first time in years, allowed herself to lean into the possibility of love that did not diminish, but magnified her. It was Margaret's nightmare and society's spectacle. Chloe Martinez and Alexander Hughes announced their union with a wedding that would redefine power in Manhattan. The ceremony was held in San Francisco, far from the ruins of the Williams legacy. The city was excited. Politicians, innovators, philanthropists, and artists gathered beneath vaulted glass ceilings, adorned with cascading white orchids. Chloe wore a gown of ivory silk that shimmered like moonlight. Her veil was light as air, her steps steady, her gaze unwavering. When she entered, whispers fell into silence, not from scandal, not from curiosity, but from awe. Alexander stood waiting, not as a conqueror, but as an equal. When she reached him, he did not grip her hand possessively, but intertwined their fingers gently, reverently, as though binding a promise older than time. Their vows were private, spoken in tones too soft for the audience to hear. What mattered was not the spectacle, but the truth exchanged between them. She was no longer the caged jewel of the Williams family, and he was not the shadowed admirer of her past. Together, they were a union of choice will and love forged in storms. The applause that followed was thunderous, but Chloe's world narrowed to the man who looked at her as if she had always belonged to herself, and yet somehow also to him. The wedding reverberated across society like an earthquake. Headlines blazed, from betrayal to empire. Chloe Martinez becomes Mrs. Hughes. The new power couple, Hughes and Martinez, redefine Manhattan influence. For the Williamses, it was the final humiliation. Elijah drowned himself in obscurity. Amelia's name erased from conversations, Margaret retreating into the hollow echo of her Hamptons mansion. Their dynasty lay in ashes, eclipsed by a new constellation. But for Chloe, the wedding was not revenge, it was resurrection. She had walked through betrayal, humiliation, and ruin, and emerged unbroken and reborn. As Mrs. Hughes, Chloe did not fade into the role of silent wife. She co-chaired philanthropic boards, presented at global conferences, and pushed forward innovations in renewable energy. Her voice carried weight not because of Alexander's influence, but because of her clarity and vision. At a conference in Geneva, she stood before world leaders, her words a symphony of intellect and passion. The future, she declared, is not built on what we inherit, but on what we create. Power is not permanence. True power is progress. The audience rose in ovation. Alexander, seated among dignitaries, did not steal the moment. He watched her pride etched into every line of his face. Despite the grandeur of their union, it was the quiet moments that defined them. Nights by the fire where Chloe curled against Alexander's shoulder, their conversations wandering from politics to poetry. She walked along the California coast, where she felt the wind in her hair and the ocean echoing her freedom. One evening, as they stood on the balcony of their home overlooking the bay, Chloe turned to him. "Do you ever fear it?" she asked. "The power we hold. The eyes are always watching." Alexander kissed her hand gently. "I don't fear it, because power in your hands is not a weapon. It's a gift, and I trust you with it more than anyone in this world." Chloe's eyes softened. For the first time in years, she believed in love not as an illusion, but as truth. The narrative of Manhattan has transformed. No longer was Chloe the humiliated wife of Elijah Williams. She was Chloe Hughes, the woman who had risen from betrayal to shape the future. Women admired her resilience, men respected her intellect, and the press could not resist the poetry of her story. She became an emblem not of scandal, but of transformation. Once she had been silenced, her voice echoed through boardrooms and banquets. Months later, fate brought her face to face with Elijah one last time. It was at a charity gala in Los Angeles, far from the city that had witnessed their ruin. Elijah, thinner now, his eyes dulled, approached her cautiously. "You've won," he said bitterly. Chloe regarded him with calm grace. "There was never a contest, Elijah. Only choices. You chose betrayal. I chose truth." His gaze faltered, and for the first time, she saw not the arrogant heir, but a broken man haunted by his own failures. She felt no triumph, no malice, only closure. She turned back to Alexander, who stood waiting, and knew she had crossed the final threshold. The past was behind her. Their union was more than love, a vision, strength, and purpose partnership. Together, they commanded wealth and influence, shaping industries, guiding philanthropy, and inspiring those who whispered behind closed doors. And for Chloe, the truest victory was not the world's applause, nor the Williams dynasty's fall. It was the quiet certainty that she had found love without chains, power without masks, and a life not defined by betrayal, but by choice. On the balcony of their San Francisco home, beneath a sky of endless stars, she whispered to herself the truth she had fought so long to reclaim. She was free, and freedom had made her powerful. The Hughes family was unlike any Chloe had ever encountered. If the Williams clan was a fragile glass empire of appearances, the Hugheses were marble and steel, rooted in legacy, expanded through centuries. Their influence woven into the very architecture of America. The Hughes name carried the weight of permanence from railroads to technology, politics to philanthropy. And now, as Alexander's wife Chloe stood at the threshold of their world, it began with an invitation, engraved in gold script on heavy cardstock, sealed with the family crest, an eagle soaring above the motto, Per aspera ad astra, through hardship to the stars. The words struck her, for they felt less like a declaration of the Hugheses and more like the truth of her life. The invitation summoned her to the centennial celebration of the Hughes dynasty, held at their ancestral estate in Los Angeles. It was not merely a family gathering, but a coronation of power, an exhibition of legacy. Senators, diplomats, industrialists, artists, all would be in attendance. And at the heart of it, Chloe would stand. The Hughes estate stretched across rolling hills, a palace of white stone, framed by gardens that bloomed even in winter. Fountains glimmered under lantern light, and classical music drifted through the air. Limousines rolled one after another along the drive, carrying the elite of America and beyond. When Chloe stepped from the car, her hand resting lightly in Alexander's cameras flashed through discreetly managed by the family's staff. She wore a gown of deep crimson silk, her shoulders bare, her presence commanding. She felt the eyes upon her, curious, assessing, doubtful. Alexander leaned close. "They will test you," he murmured. "Not because they doubt me, because they want to know if you are worthy of us." Chloe's lips curved faintly. "Let them test. They will find I am not the woman they expect." Inside the grand hall, portraits of ancestors loomed on gilded walls, their gazes stern and unyielding. The room buzzed with conversation, laughter gilded with calculation. Chloe was introduced to cousins, uncles, and matriarchs with diamonds like miniature sons. There was Cordelia Hughes, Alexander's aunt, whose fortune funded half the museums in California. She studied Chloe with a smile as sharp as glass. "So you are the woman who turned New York on its head," Cordelia said. "They call you a phoenix." Chloe met her gaze calmly. A phoenix does not rise for spectacle. It rises because there is no other choice. Cordelia's eyes narrowed, but a flicker of respect crossed her face. Then there was Jonathan Hughes, Alexander's cousin, an industrial magnate with ambitions to rival his own. He took Chloe's hand with a smirk. "You've traded quite well, Mrs. Hughes, from the ashes of one dynasty to the throne of another." Chloe withdrew her hand gracefully. "Thrones are dangerous things, Mr. Hughes. I prefer foundations. They last longer." The smirk faded. Jonathan looked at her differently after that. As the evening unfolded, speeches were made, tributes paid. Finally, Alexander was called to speak as heir, and now husband, the man who embodied the dynasty's future. But when he rose, he did something unexpected. He took Chloe's hand and drew her forward. The crowd stirred with surprise. Wives in their world did not speak. They adorned and supported, but did not stand at the center. Yet Alexander, with quiet defiance, placed her before them. "My family," he said, his voice deep and steady. "We celebrate a century tonight, 100 years of triumph, legacy, and power. But tonight, I celebrate something more. I celebrate the woman beside me. She is not Hughes by birth, but by spirit. She is why the next century will continue and surpass our legacy. I give you my wife, Chloe." A ripple passed through the hall. Expectation, skepticism, curiosity. Chloe stood in the spotlight, her heart steady. She spoke not with trembling nerves, but with the voice of a woman who had already weathered storms greater than this. "Dynasties are not built on names," she began. "They are built on choices, on sacrifice, on vision, on courage, when others fear change. I was not born into the Hughes family. I was tested by fire, and I emerged not to inherit, but to create. If you would measure me, do not measure the ashes of my past, but the flame of my future." The hall was silent, rapt. Then applause erupted, hesitant at first, then swelling into thunder. Not all were convinced. Later in the shadowed gardens, Cordelia approached her again. "You speak well," she said, "too well. But eloquence is not enough. The Hughes dynasty is not a stage for speeches. It is a battlefield. And on battlefields, eloquence dies quickly." Chloe's eyes glimmered in the lantern light. "Then it is fortunate I know more than words. I have built, I have fought, I have risen from ruins. Eloquence may falter on the battlefield, but resolve does not. Cordelia studied her, then gave a curt nod. We will see. Inside the orchestra swelled. Alexander extended his hand and Chloe accepted. They danced beneath chandeliers, the room watching the whispers swirling. He held her with a steadiness that calmed the storm around them. You silenced them, he murmured. No, Chloe replied softly. I reminded them that silence is never mine. He smiled, his gaze proud. You were born for this. She shook her head. I was not born for it. I chose it. That is the difference. And he understood. The next day, a private council was held among the Hughes elders. Chloe was invited, though tradition did not require her presence. She sat at the long mahogany table, surrounded by portraits of men who had commanded empires. Questions came pointed, deliberate. What is your vision for philanthropy? Asked one. How do you intend to protect our reputation? Asked another. What separates you from the women who came before you? Asked a third. Chloe answered each without hesitation. She spoke of sustainability, progress, and truth as the foundation of legacy. She did not flatter them, did not yield to their pride. She said her place at the table was not borrowed, but earned. By the end, silence lingered, not of dismissal, but of consideration. As Chloe and Alexander prepared to leave the estate that evening, Cordelia approached again. Her expression, though still sharp, carried something different acknowledgement. You may not have been born Hughes, she said quietly, but tonight, you became one. Chloe inclined her head. I did not become Hughes. I remained Chloe, and that is enough. Cordelia's lips curved into the faintest smile. Perhaps that is why you belong. As their car rolled away from the estate, Chloe gazed at the night sky. The stars shimmered above the hills, infinite and untamed. She thought of the motto engraved on the invitation, per aspera ad astra, through hardship to the stars. The words lingered in her mind, not as a family creed, but as her own truth. She had walked through hardship, through betrayal, through fire. And now, standing beside Alexander, she felt the stars within reach, not as gifts bestowed, but as destinies claimed. The Hughes dynasty had gathered to measure her. They had tested her, doubted her, questioned her. And she had answered not with submission, but with self. In doing so, she had not only secured her place among them, she had redefined what it meant to belong. The winter sun over Los Angeles was gentle pale gold, spilling across the hills, but anticipation burned with quiet intensity inside the Hughes estate. The centennial celebration had passed, and the Hughes family had tested Chloe and accepted her. Yet unfinished business lingered like a shadow behind her business that demanded closure, not for society, not even for Alexander, but for herself. For though she stood now as Chloe Hughes' wife, partner, visionary, she was still Chloe Martinez, the woman who had endured a decade of humiliation at the hands of the Williams family. The storm she had unleashed upon them was nearly complete. Nearly, but not entirely. Closure required confrontation. It came almost ironically, not from Chloe herself, but from Margaret Williams. Desperation breeds strange choices, and watching her family sink into obscurity, Margaret clung to the hope that one meeting could salvage what remained. A letter arrived at Chloe's office in Manhattan, written in the careful hand of a woman who had once commanded armies of socialites. Chloe, for the sake of what once was family, I ask you to meet me. There are matters unfinished and words unsaid. I beg you not for reconciliation, but for understanding. Daniel advised against it. Alexander frowned when she showed him, but Chloe's eyes gleamed with quiet certainty. I will go, she said, because this story began with them, and it must end with me. The meeting was arranged at the Williams mansion in the Hamptons, now half abandoned. The gardens had grown wild, the fountains dry, the chandeliers dim. Chloe arrived silently, her crimson coat trailing behind her like a war banner. Inside, Margaret waited with Elijah and Sophia. Time had not been kind. Margaret's regal air was chipped with desperation, Elijah's arrogance reduced to bitterness, and Sophia's sharpness dulled into resignation. When Chloe entered, they rose as though before royalty, though none would admit it. Chloe, Margaret began, her voice strained. Thank you for coming. We are not here to beg. We are here because the world has turned its back on us, and you, whether you intended or not, are the cause. Chloe removed her gloves slowly, her movements deliberate. I am not the cause, Margaret. I am the consequence. You sowed betrayal, cruelty, deceit. I was merely the mirror that showed the world what you are. Elijah bristled. You ruined me. Do you know what I've lost? Chloe's gaze turned to him, cold but steady. You lost nothing I took. You lost what you threw away, my love, trust, and years. You ruined yourself, Elijah, and the world only witnessed it. Sophia for once spoke softly. And now, what do you want from us? To watch us crawl? Chloe's lips curved faintly. No, I want nothing from you. That is the triumph. For 10 years you controlled me, diminished me, fed on my silence. Now you hold no power over me. I have already walked away. And when one walks away from fire, she does not look back to see the ashes. They faltered under her words, but Margaret made one final attempt. You may have society's admiration now, Chloe, but dynasties rise and fall. One day the Hughes name will fade too. Then what will you have? Chloe's eyes glimmered, not with cruelty, but with clarity. I will have myself, and that, Margaret, is something you never possessed. She rose to leave, but paused at the threshold. Turning again, her voice softened, an elegy rather than a strike. Your downfall is not my revenge. It is your inheritance, and I leave it to you. Then she walked away, the echo of her heels, the final note in a symphony of endings. Back in San Francisco, Chloe returned not to fanfare, but to work. Her days were filled with projects in renewable energy and collaborations with innovators across the globe. Her name appeared not only in society columns, but in scientific journals, her ideas shaping policies, her vision inspiring movements. Alexander was ever at her side, not as a shield, but as a partner. They traveled together, building foundations, funding schools, and supporting communities, long ignored by dynasties, concerned only with themselves. Everywhere she went, Chloe carried herself not as a woman who had inherited power, but as one who had claimed it. The Williams family was spoken of less and less, fading into irrelevance. In contrast, Chloe's influence grew brighter, a beacon of what resilience and reinvention could achieve. Months later, at a global summit in Tokyo, Chloe addressed leaders from every continent. Her voice carried across the vast hall, strong and resonant. We live in a world obsessed with legacy, she said, with names, with dynasties, with the illusion of permanence. However, true legacy is not in the name we inherit, but in the future we create. A name once silenced me. Now I carry none but my own. And with it, I build not for myself, but for the generations who will come after. Applause thundered, but Chloe's gaze sought Alexander's in the crowd. His eyes, steady and proud, told her the truth she already knew. Her journey had come full circle. The girl who had once been caged in marble halls had become a woman who stood at the helm of the world. One evening on the balcony of their San Francisco home, Chloe stood with Alexander as the city glittered below. The air was cool, the stars sharp in the night sky. Do you ever regret? Alexander asked softly. Chloe shook her head. No. Pain teaches. Betrayal reveals. Without it, I would never have known my strength. And without knowing my strength, I would never have known love. He drew her close, his embrace steady. She leaned into him not as a woman who needed protection, but as one who chose love freely without chains. The past was closed. The Williams name was dust, and Chloe Martinez Hughes, woman, wife, visionary survivor, stood in her final triumph, free, influential, and beloved. Stories linger beyond their endings. They live in the whispers of those who retell them, in the lessons carried by those who listen. Chloe's story was not merely one of betrayal and revenge. It was one of transformation, of fire turned into light. And for those who heard it, the call was clear when faced with betrayal silenced by cruelty and caged by others' expectations: rise. Rise, as Chloe did not only to survive, but to triumph.